9, 8, and we're live.
All right.
10, 9, 8.
All right.
Okay. You want to do the intro this time, Jed?
Yeah, sure. Well, we're back for part two of George MacDonald's wonderful essay, "The Fantastic Imagination," and for right now, it's just Sherry and I. We're gonna kind of dive in where we left off and kind of mind the mind of a man who is
About an
definitely inspiring
amazing man.
to both of us and a lot of people within this community, and
Mhm.
just see what he has to say about the imagination, which is among the most powerful of the spiritual tools at our disposal, I believe. So,
Yep.
did you want me to go ahead and just dive in and start reading from where we left
Yep.
off last time? So, he
Sounds
had
good.
been talking about, just to kind of back up and build some context, he had been
Sure.
talking about natural laws and the connection of law to beauty and truth. And so, we're going to go ahead and pick up and natural law as we form imaginative worlds and form our stories, that even stories themselves have certain laws and rules that they abide by. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up here, and he's going to shift into talking about moral laws. Okay. So in the moral world, it is different. There, a man may clothe in new forms, and for this employ his imagination freely, but he must invent nothing. He may not, for any purpose, turn its laws upside down. He must not meddle with with the relations of live souls. The laws of the spirit of man must hold, alike in this world and in any world he may invent. It were no offense to suppose a world in which everything repelled instead of attracted the things around it. It would be wicked to write a tale representing a man it called good as always doing bad things, or a man it called bad always doing good things. The notion itself is absolutely lawless. In physical things, a man may invent. In moral things, he must obey and take their laws with him into his invented world as well. Did we want to stop there? Or you want me to keep going?
What do you think? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I do, because I think that this has application beyond story writing.
Yep.
Um, but like a certain, I mean, I think that moral law is always a sticky subject to discuss because people have different understandings of morality.
Yeah.
But I think there's some basics that we can all agree on. So maybe, you know, like the golden rule of do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, right?
Yeah.
There's a reciprocity in the moral universe that I think we all, at some level, universally accept.
Yeah.
And um,
And like he says here, not calling bad things good and good things bad in
right,
in the story verse. But I think it's also true for for everyday life, right?
right,
Like what comes to my mind in that sense is raising children.
mm-hmm,
As a parent, you know, you want to say, you want to say um, when they've done something good,
mm-hmm,
you want to call it good, and when they've done something bad, you want to call it bad, right?
right,
Because they need to know they need to be able to make that discernment. And if Steve Martin, I remember years ago, he had this he had this comedy sketch, and he says, I know a really good trick you can play on a 2-year old. And he says, teach them to talk wrong. And and you're just like, what? Why would what?
that's
And
too
then, and then the line is, so that when they're in kindergarten, they raise their hand and then they say, "Can I mumbo dog face in the banana patch?"
funny.
But essentially, that's what you're doing to a kid if you teach them that moral law the other way around, right? Teach them
Yeah,
to call good things bad and bad things good. So
yeah.
anyway, that's
Yeah,
what
well,
came.
it makes me think of like a scenario where like a historical failure of the moral imagination, um, is like when cultures clash, right? So when the Calvinist missionaries went out to the Hawaiian Islands, one of the things they wanted to get the people to do was to dress in a Western way, which included wearing shoes. And so they planted these trees, and I forget what they were called, but they dropped these like thorny little seedlings and branches to where anywhere you walk around the island, you're going to pick up these thorns in your feet if you're not wearing at least something to
Heavens.
cover your feet. Right. And, their idea was like, we want them to conform to the expectations of our Western morality, but never really considered the deeper moral question at play, which is like, is this something that you would want your neighbor to move into your neighborhood and do in your neighborhood?
Right.
You know,
Hmm.
and like, this universal sense that we all want to feel like a sense of value and dignity, and to have that recognized is something that transcends space and time. Any
Hmm.
culture, there's going to be an element of honor that there's a cultural expectation. That cultural expectation may change, but the underlying principle doesn't.
Hmm.
And when we're forming stories and when we're imagining worlds, that's actually where a lot of like Rene Girard is really interesting on this, as far as his moral insights, is because a lot of times, even as we frame our own stories, we're not necessarily aware of um, the way they depict the human moral situation.
Our
And
our stories we're not aware
like
of.
even authors, like like he would use like Greek tragedy as an
Hmm.
example, right? Is that in these great tragedies, like you see these massive moral tales that maybe even the culture itself could not perceive, because it's kind of like, can a fish perceive the water it
Oh, I see
swims
what
in?
you're saying. Yeah.
But
Okay.
as
Yeah.
you pull away from it, you can see these vast moral dilemmas with a lot more clarity than maybe somebody that was
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
Greece at the time, watching one of Sophocles' plays, may not have been able to pick up on,
Right.
on the deeper morality at play there. And what Girard would do is he would examine, him and another great literary critic, Eric Auerbach, um, were able to kind of examine the evolution of morality and consciousness throughout time, um, and to see these great dilemmas that see themselves surfacing and resurfacing time and time again. Um,
So are
so
you
Eric,
talking about like a universal morality? Like,
yeah, I think there's like, I mean, this is me kind of getting into my sense of things. I don't know how well this tracks, but I think there's a moral relativity at play, but it's relative to a center, kind of
hmm,
like our
yeah.
planets are
Hmm.
relative to a sun,
Right.
right? So there's a set of moral relations and a harmony that we're kind of seeking, right?
Right.
So if a storyteller is like creating this chaotic and ambiguous moral universe, a lot of times, like, what will end up happening is the tale itself will fall apart.
Yes. Yeah.
It loses coherence, we lose interest, because there's no correspondence to the world that we live in.
Yeah.
And I
Which is,
think there's
yeah.
I think that's an element of like storytelling, but just basic human relations that he's laying out here.
Yeah. Well, like I would go so far as to say that the story is always being told around us in the natural world. That like,
Mm,
the story is how do I put this? I mean, you could reduce it, you could get really reductive about it, and you could reduce it down to birth, death, and resurrection kind of story, right?
mm,
Um, but yeah, I just think that there are certain patterns in the natural world that are telling the story that we love, right?
mm,
We love the story of salvation, right?
mm,
Of redemption. We love that story. And so and that's the story that nature tells us, right? It's a story of healing and mercy and redemption and death and birth and rebirth and all that
Hmm.
stuff, right? And so we're actually, from the way I look at it, we're actually in the story, right? We're in that story.
Hmm.
And I think that's why we love that story, because that
Hmm.
is our story,
Hmm.
right? It's ours.
Yeah.
And it, I think it's fairly evident. I mean, there are different cultural norms and taboos and things that are allowed and things that aren't allowed, but
Hmm.
but it's pretty universal as far as, unless you're a cannibal or a headhunter. I don't know what their morality is like.
I don't know any personally, but I
I
know of.
don't either. But the 10 commandments kind of fits that bill, right? Of this like universal morality, you know. You
Yeah.
don't take what's not yours, you know. You have to cooperate in order to get by, right? And so these are the rules of cooperation, and you
Hmm.
need some kind of higher power to focus your attention on, otherwise you get stuck in mimetic rivalry.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, those
So
are
I
my.
have a question based just something you said that kind of stuck out to me is like, our story encompasses like the narrative structure of our story encompasses birth, death, and resurrection. And
Mhm.
we're talking, in the context of McDonald's essay here about, natural and moral law. And, as Christians, like, I think the concept of resurrection is something we take as a given that a lot of other belief systems do not,
Mhm.
right? But I
That's true.
do wonder, like, this, not to get in the weeds of a bunch of intra-Christian theological debates, but I've wondered at times if resurrection itself is not a natural process or end for which creation exists, right? Because we tend to think of it as like a supernatural act.
Well,
And I
when
don't
I yeah.
disagree with that, but
Mhm.
I wonder if
I'm
there's
not
also
thinking
a
about
way
it
of,
in those terms, actually.
is like,
Um,
I wonder if there's an element of resurrection that it is the culmination of, for lack of better term, like the natural or the cosmic process. Is That's the fruit, that's the harvest of the cosmos itself, is what is resurrected and endures beyond. I don't know.
well, when I think of resurrection, I think this is why I'm not so keen on reincarnation,
Hmm.
because I think reincarnation is a badly is a misunderstood version of resurrection. That's what I think it is. Like, and reincarnation is easy to see in the natural world. Like,
Hmm.
so a tree falls down in the forest, right?
Hmm.
Like I was hiking in a coastal rainforest in on Vancouver Island, and there's this huge Sitka spruce laying on the ground, and on top of the Sitka spruce were baby Sitka spruces growing.
Hmm.
Okay, and they were nourishing themselves from the body of the one laying on the ground,
Hmm.
right? And so when I looked at that, I was like, that's resurrection for me as a Christian,
Hmm.
right? But that would be for many other people a form of reincarnation.
Hmm.
Like
I have
what do you think of that? Like, I don't
I
know.
well, I think that, like, so David Armstrong, he writes over at Perennial Digression. He's done some interesting work on this, and I'm open to certain kinds of reincarnation, and I don't think that it's necessarily. Um, I think that there are certain models of reincarnation that are compatible with resurrection, and certain ones that aren't, right? And um, so I'll give this example. I think we're engaged in reincarnation right now, right? And so the example I would use is we are reading the essay of a man who has long
Right.
since passed, right? And it's the activity of his soul, and his intellect and
Yeah.
his spiritual activity is being woven in and incarnated into the activity of our soul, of our spiritual activity as well. And so I think that,
Right.
like, there's an element of soul that's kind of like a life force that has many different layers, some of which are very closely associated with our own identity, our ego formation, and the sense of like who we are in this body. And I think that that is also the aspect that resurrects, right? So, but then I think there are more collective elements of soul the higher up you get, to where, in a sense, we are all incarnations of each other. And
Yeah.
through this series of interlocking relations. And so when people have like, there's interesting things out there as far as like credible past life regressions and those kinds of things. It's not that the individual ego recycles over lifetimes as much as like that psychic part of ourselves, the soul, has different aspects that go on, and then there's parts that remain with us, and that's the part that is the subject of resurrection, what we would think of as like our person or our own individual subjectivity that raises up. But the soul has its energies that go on. Obviously, like, we reincarnate what we read from dead authors all the time. We're taking their ideas and making them our own.
Or
But I
or could we, instead of saying reincarnate, because even if we take their ideas, like you said, we take their ideas, but we make them our own.
mm,
Okay. So we're not we're not entirely them.
no,
We're not
no, we're
reincarnations.
not.
We are incarnations. So like the perfect definition of incarnation is the word made flesh. And I
Hmm.
just yesterday watched a really great lecture that Malcolm gave on this.
Hmm.
I don't think I can remember all of it, but this is also an
I'm
intuition that
listening.
I've
I'm
had.
just grabbing something here.
Yeah, this is an intuition I've had for a long time, that this is what poetic relations are. This is mediating heaven and earth. This is, a lot of all that kind of language. And I'm not sure why people want to talk about the technicalities of, because for me this is what this is. This is talking about the body, the soul, the spirit, the parts, that what stays, what goes, what repeats itself, all that stuff. I can say yes to all of that,
Hmm.
but I don't think it's very interesting to talk about. I guess that's
Hmm.
the thing for me. It's not that interesting to talk about the details.
Hmm.
Um, because I would start out on the premise that we're all um, fearfully and wonderfully made and known,
Hmm.
right? And that
Hmm.
heaven, for me anyway, heaven is to know as I am known,
Hmm.
right? Which implies that there is a me to know,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, and as far as incarnation goes, we're like you said, we're gonna constantly be incarnating. Words are constantly being made flesh,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So this is why I think, and I haven't really given it a whole lot of thought, but I don't dislike the idea of reincarnation because it crosses paths with my dogma. That doesn't
Hmm.
have anything to do with it, right?
Hmm.
To me, it's a simplification of a more complex
Yeah.
thing.
Well, I think, and I get that. I think that what interests me in the reincarnation aspect of other spiritual traditions is, um, there's a wholeness, a sense of interconnectivity, that everything is at its fundamental level bound up in that fundamental unity, right? And
Yes.
that there's a repetition that I think there has value, but what resurrection teaches us, that I think reincarnation does not, is the weight of personhood, right? The weight of the person's life from birth to death has meaning and purpose, and it's not just on some endless cycle that gets repeated over and over again. There's something irrepeatable about that individual person that is still belongs to the whole, right? And but
Would
I
you?
do think that, like, I think that if we even just look at what the terms, I mean, not so much how they're used, but if you kind of just look at the terms themselves, to remember or to reincarnate was essentially describing the same thing.
Yeah,
It's a
but
recollection of a connection to the past,
well, okay,
or of something that already is.
okay. So this is what's going through my mind right now. See how you
Mm-hmm.
feel about this. So incarnation is the word made flesh,
Mm-hmm.
which seems to me to be a bit of a descent, right? It seems like a
Mm-hmm.
descent because the word happens to be ethereal. It's just out there. It's breath, right? Comes out
Mm-hmm.
of the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly it takes on a form. So it has descended into something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
Resurrection is the flesh made spirit. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's the other way around. It's back
Mm-hmm.
to the breath again, right?
Right.
It's a returning movement.
Mm-hmm.
So you get the U-shape
Mm-hmm.
journey with 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 that concept, right, of incarnation, a
Mm-hmm.
falling into, right, a descent, and resurrection is an ascension, right,
Mm-hmm.
into spirit. And you know, so when you were talking about um what you just said before, I'm trying to think of how you put it. Reincarnation is like rebodied, right? Is that
Mm-hmm.
how you put it?
Yeah.
Um, what comes to my mind is that vision that I had when I was a kid
Mm-hmm.
of the glowing orbs, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they they all returned to form a corpus, like
Mm-hmm.
a
Corporeal
body,
form. Yeah.
right? It was a body, but it wasn't shaped like a body, but it was a
Mm-hmm.
body in the sense that they all belonged to it.
Mm-hmm.
It, right? They had a thing to return to.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of reincarnation for me is like there is no ascension in that. It's a horizontal, like it feels like the closed world of the serpent to me.
Right. Right. And it taken, if that's all there is, and I think that's, I mean, show my cards. I think that is what is very unique about the Christian story. I don't think that it's overturning the notion that there are cyclical elements within the cosmos, but it's what it's doing is it's saying that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, right?
Yeah.
And and the and that there is a narrative structure to our being that's not just simply caught up in the cycle of samsara, birth, death, rebirth, death. The
Mhm.
things that what's observable in nature, right? Is like there's something within nature that takes us beyond nature, or takes us above nature, and it's actually that descent of being born from above that initiates that U-shaped journey, and all of a sudden breaks the circle,
Right.
right? And it doesn't mean that the circle doesn't exist. It just means that the circle itself has to be transcended.
Right.
But like, so like I've been reading in the Upanishads, and there's this interesting like introduction to the first Upanishad, which is the Isha Upanishad, and it says this. It says, all this is full. All that is full. Fullness comes. When fullness is taken from fullness, fullness still remains. Right? So to connect it to like how we're incarnating or reincarnating George MacDonald's writings right now, those are complete and full. Like George MacDonald is not just diminished by the fact that we are incarnating the spiritual and psychic output of his life's work. He's not diminished by that. And it's not that our fullness is diminished by that. It's like who we are fully, but it's just another experience of fullness. And so I think that there's like, I don't know if I'm making a ton of sense here, but it's not, there's a great documentary right now on Netflix called Infinity, which just discusses like the mathematics of infinity. And
Okay.
like, if you divide an infinity or multiply an infinity, you're going to end up with an infinity. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like, and I think that's where like the Dharmic schools, what they don't necessarily touch upon is that, you know, while they talk about the self being somewhat identical with the one or the absolute or with God, right, at some level, is their sense is there's a sense of reabsorption into the divine, and that the personal identity is dropped.
Yeah.
Right. But like what the doctrine of resurrection says and states that's very different is that the personal identity is in itself an infinity.
Well, see, this is why I just keep going back to my little glowing orbs, right? Because one of them was me. Is what I saw, right? And I knew that. So it was the me that was thinking about me, thinking about dying. And that me doesn't die. Okay? But then it becomes it. So then I see it as this little glowing orb, and it returns back to this body, right? Which is all like it's just other glowing orbs that form this body. Okay. And but me is not lost. Me is home. Me is home, right?
Yeah.
This is the and so there it's the perfect, like it's the perfect one in the many. It's the perfect example of the one in the many, right?
Yeah.
And so we form the body. Right? We are the body of Christ.
Right.
And my 5-year-old self did not know that, okay?
Yeah.
At the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, so there's no loss of personhood. And you know, just to say this, just to add to that craziness, what really struck me later on in my life was that didn't bother me as a 5-year-old. You know, most 5-year-olds would be really traumatized by a loss of their physical identity. You would think.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I had already abstracted out that there was a me that thought about me thinking. Right? And I'd already come to the conclusion that this part of me is going to die. Right? But there's another part of me that doesn't. And so anyway, I just to
have you just described the witness, Sherry?
I don't know. We'll have to.
Me that witnesses the me. Yeah. Anyway, that runs far afield from the McDonald discussion.
That's.
Do you want me to? We will discuss that.
We'll talk about that another time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want me to go ahead and dive into the next few paragraphs and see what we can mine?
Okay, I'll do a little reading this time.
Sure.
Okay. So there's a question. Quote: "You write as if a fairy tale were a thing of importance. Must it have meaning?" And George replies, "It cannot help having some meaning. If it have proportion and harmony, it has vitality. And vitality is truth. The beauty may be plainer in it than the truth, but without the truth, the beauty could not be, and the fairy tale would give no delight. Everyone, however, who feels the story will read its meaning after his own nature and development. One man will read one meaning in it, another will read another. So here's my question. Did he just describe subjective meaning?
Oh yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and you know, it as we read ahead, like he unpacks that even more. But
Yeah.
like, it reminds me of listening to one of the interviews. It may have been a Grail Country interview with Jordan Daniel Wood when he was talking about, but it was one of his interviews. I just don't remember which one, but um, how like each text and each word represents an infinity of meaning,
Mm-hmm.
right? And specifically, like within like the church fathers, how Maximus might have interpreted Gregory, who was interpreting, you know, John, right? Is there's this continuity of an unfolding of an infinite pool of meaning within their interpretations that open up new vistas of meaning for us to mine and then to continue that story of interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I mean, growing up in an evangelical world, like where our hermeneutic, and I was like, at least it, like maybe, for lack of a better term, I grew up among thinking evangelicals, right? Who
Mm-hmm.
took the biblical text seriously and interpreting the text seriously.
Yeah.
And this even comes out of like the Westminster Confessions for like Presbyterian and Reformed communions, is their idea is that there's one meaning of the text,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know.
right?
Yeah.
And I had that discussion with a Presbyterian elder once, and I was like, well, is that one of singularity or one of of multiplicity or of unity? Is there a unified sense of meaning, or is there a singular sense of meaning? And he wanted to argue for a singular sense of meaning, that every biblical text meant something, right?
Which means
And
then you have to impose that thing on the text,
well, I mean, for a lack of
right?
a better term, like I wish that this will sound harsh, but like what it does is it reduces the Bible to a book of magic spells
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
where we unlock its meaning by deciphering, cracking the code of what the words are saying. And then we have reduced it down to a distilled meaning that then gives us power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's magic.
Mm-hmm.
That's what magic is,
Yeah.
right? I don't think the Bible is a magic book.
Right.
I think it's much more than that. I don't think it's less than that. Sure, if you want to call it magic, that's fine. I mean, I wouldn't use the term,
But not one that you wield.
yeah, it's not for sorcery. But
Right.
unfortunately, like and I don't think like Christians are meaning to engage in the
No,
activities
they're
of
not.
warlocks and sorcerers when they're
No.
interpreting the biblical text, but functionally they're not doing something terribly dissimilar when you try to say that we can distill this text down to this definite meaning, and that within this definite meaning are the confines of all the meaning that you can ever find within this text.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's probably more, not so much some dark urge toward necromancy as much as it's just a modernist impulse to think that we can locate some singular meaning and that has settled everything.
Yeah, and the thing is, like even in conversations in the recent past with people, you'll talk about, let's say, faith. I'll talk to you about faith.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that mean? What does faith mean to me? And what does it mean to you? Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
like even the words have,
Mm-hmm.
different meanings. So anyway, let's just keep reading here because it gets
Sure.
better. Okay, so another question. Quote, if so, how am I to assure myself that I am not reading my own meaning into it, but yours out of it? This is my favorite part of this whole thing. Why should you be so assured? It may be better that you should read your meaning into it. That may be a higher operation of your intellect than the mere reading of mine out of it. Your meaning may be superior to mine.
Ooh,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that is like the first question is like it just hits with a sledgehammer.
Yeah.
Why should you be so assured? And like because like the question itself like is answering the question of you know, almost this timidity of I don't want to misinterpret your text, right? And I think that, you know, there's this sense of like I don't want to get this wrong,
That's right. That's what it's
right?
about. Yeah.
And which is in itself that's a power play. Like and it's really funny because like, you know, postmodern literary theorists will talk about how texts and narratives are power plays and that kind of stuff, and maybe
Yeah.
to a degree they have something to say. I'm not big in postmodern hermeneutics myself, but I think that like what's interesting is McDonald is anticipating some of their findings, you know, 80 100 years before they're really exploring those, you know, guys like Jacques Derrida and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Is like he's saying no, you should not be so assured that you know what I mean,
Yeah.
and I should not be so assured that whatever meaning you derive from what I write isn't better than the meaning I understand myself.
Yeah. Right.
And that what that opens it up to is the idea that a text or a story is a living thing,
That's right.
you
Yeah.
know.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Okay, next. Suppose my child ask me what the fairy tale means. What am I to say? These are people who are so worried, right? They're so worried and they're so nervous. And I always want to say to them, don't worry, be happy. If you do not know what it means, what is easier than to say so? I got to let that sink in. Did you guys hear that? If you do not know what it means, what is easier than to say so? Like, I don't know, right? If you do see a meaning in it, there it is for you to give to him. It's not rocket science, folks.
Yeah.
A genuine work of art must mean many things. The truer its art, the more things it will mean. If my drawing, on the other hand, is so far from being a work of art that it needs "This is a horse" written under it, what can it matter that neither you nor your child should know what it means? Oh, it is there. It is there not so much to convey a meaning as to wake a meaning. If it do not even, excuse me, if it do not even wake an interest, throw it aside. A meaning may be there, but it is not for you. If again you do not know a horse when you see it, the name written under it will not serve you much. At all events, the business of the painter is not to teach zoology. And then he makes this beautiful defense of childhood and childlikeness. But indeed, your children are not likely to trouble you about the meaning. They find what they are capable of finding, and more would be too much. For my part, I do not write for children, but for the childlike, whether of 5 or 50 or 75. So, any thoughts there, Jed?
I mean, I think like the word that like pops into my mind here is just play. Like like any good art or text or anything that has meaning is an invitation to play with it. You know, and I don't think, you know, play is this more serious you are about play, the more fun it becomes. Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, you know, I used to play organized sports, and the real fun was when you were in the game. But there was a lot of work that went to going to be able to get into the game, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the play becomes serious, but it's because it's all that seriousness builds into the enjoyment, and it becomes a part of the enjoyment. And like I think there's a playfulness that we lack when we're approaching, issues surrounding the imagination is like the mind is doing something different when it's at play than when you're just looking at it as laboring through a text.
Well, see, what I'm thinking about it instead of the word play is freedom,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Yeah. So like when the person asks, suppose my child asks me what the fairy tale means, what am I to say? He's bound to something.
Mm-hmm.
He's shackled to something. There are
Mm-hmm.
expectations on him. He needs to know, right?
Mm-hmm.
I got to come up with something, you know? And George
Mm-hmm.
goes, no, no. He throws the doors wide open and he goes,
Mm-hmm.
it's okay. You can say you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
You're
Well,
free, you
he's
know?
kind of inviting you into that guilelessness of childhood
Yes.
that is okay with not knowing things, is okay with asking questions, because sometimes the questions you bring to a text, in this
Mhm.
case, or a fairy tale, are more substantial than the answers you're going to
Well,
derive from them.
I actually think, and he says that in the other essay, that the imagination, there's more imagination in coming up with a good question than there is in just stating the facts, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Well, I
that's
mean, I
a lot
know
of
this
work.
from just my professional life. I mean, how many endeavors fail because we never asked the right question to begin
Yeah.
with,
Mm-hmm.
never bothered ourselves to ask the right questions,
Yeah.
or even to ask good questions, you know. And
Yeah.
like the question itself is, it's a it's a curiosity.
Yeah.
It's an openness to what I don't know.
Yeah.
And like if you
And you have
if
to
you have
start
a
with that. Like you have to start with knowing that you don't know.
yeah.
Like otherwise you will never formulate the question. You'll always just try to know. Or at least appear
Yeah.
to look like you know.
Well, and then when it comes to knowledge, we're only ever just beginning. The
Mhm.
field of knowledge is infinite. So it doesn't
Mhm.
matter how much
Mhm.
you've accumulated, you have accumulated nothing. Like I'm going back right now and reading through some of Plato's works. I was reading his Apology, which is the trial of Socrates. And, one of the curious things about Socrates is he claimed to know nothing,
Yeah.
and he meant it.
Yeah.
So like his whole philosophical paradigm was built around questions, not answers.
Yes.
Right. And and the oracle deemed him to be the wisest man that ever lived.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because he knew everything, but because he could ask. Well, I mean, this is implicit in it, is that because he knew how to ask good questions. It takes an incredible amount of knowledge to be able to ask a good question.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Okay, so you're going to have to help me out with this next bit because I
I
know
know
what I'm.
I've this is already, as we got to it, I was like, oh man, this is gonna be fun. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and read.
Yeah.
A fairy tale is not an allegory. There may be allegory in it, but it not an allegory. Okay, sometimes his grammar kills me, but it not an allegory. He must be an artist indeed, who can in any mode produce a strict allegory that is not a weariness to the spirit. An allegory must be mastery or mordich.
Okay, so I looked up mortgage. Do you know what that is?
I have no idea, but that
Okay, so let me see here. Mortgage is, let me see here. Mortgage is a part of London's town moat was a muddy sewer draining moorfields, and it was also a public park adjoining Bethlehem Hospital for the insane. It has usually been assumed that the mud and filth of Mortgage accounted for the attribution of melancholy.
interesting. I wonder if that's where Tolkien came up with the word Mordor.
Oh, I betcha.
And that actually, I mean, what this, because like McDonald like wields such an outsized influence on both C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien.
Mhm.
I think that this paragraph is cuts to the very big difference between the two of them as authors, is that Um, Tolkien had little patience for some of Lewis's writings because he felt like it was too much of an allegory, of a one
Right.
to one allegory. And in
Yeah.
some senses, I think that's a fair criticism of like the Chronicles of Narnia. Um, but Tolkien was very self consciously trying to write fairy tales. And
Mm-hmm.
so there wasn't like a Christ figure in his novels, even though it was a very Christian fantasy. um, because his idea was like, no, this there can't be just one to one correspondences between this character is that character, or you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And an allegory tends to make that one to one
Yeah.
correlation, and the fairy tale is more about. And it's not to say that Lewis doesn't. His Narnia are fairy tales, but they were very allegorical.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like one of the things that makes Tolkien's work so enduring is just the expansive vistas and worlds that they open up. And a good fairy tale does that, and it allows the world to kind of operate on its own terms, as opposed to
Yeah.
saying, in this world, Aslan corresponds to Jesus, right? In your world. It's like, well, that's nice. And I like that in Lewis's works, but I do like Tolkien's overall world building better because he allows those worlds to grow organically on their own.
Right. Yeah.
An allegory is a good method of interpretation. I just don't know if it's a great method of framing stories themselves.
So if it's not an allegory, then so he's not saying what it is, he's saying what it isn't. So a fairy tale is a fairy tale because he does. Is it before this where he talks about yeah, I think it is, where he says, if I were begged to describe the fairy tale or define what it is, I would make answer that I should as soon think of describing the abstract human face or stating what must go to constitute a human being. A fairy tale is just a fairy tale, as a face is just a face. And all fairy tales I know, I think Undine the most beautiful. So he's not. He's saying that it's not an allegory. There may be an allegory in it, or there may be allegory in it, but it is not an allegory.
Yeah. No, and like any fairy tale has its kind of its own. It's a world that can stand on its own.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It doesn't rely on an external world outside of it to draw its meaning or its existence.
Okay, so that above quote that I read, I talked with Jess at length today about the face.
Mm-hmm.
And when you search the word face in the novel Lilith, it's all like just hundreds of times he uses the word face. But there is a very favorite portion in Lilith that I love. And I think it's kind of interesting because he makes that comparison of a fairy tale to a face, right? So let's just read this quickly. This is from Lilith, and the main character goes into this castle, and there are these people, and they're all dancing with each other. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
A moon had risen while I slept and was shining through the countless windowed roof, but her light was crossed by so many shadows that at first I could distinguish almost nothing of the faces of the multitude. I could not fail, however, to perceive that there was something odd about them. I sat up to see them better. Heavens! Could I call them faces? They were skull fronts, hard, gleaming bone, bare jaws, truncated noses, lipless teeth, which could no more take part in any smile. Of these, some flashed set and white and murderous. Others were clouded with decay, broken and gapped, colored of the earth in which they seemed so long to have lain. Fearfuller yet, the eye sockets were not empty. In each was a lidless living eye. In those wrecks of faces, glowed or flashed or sparkled eyes of every color, shape, and expression. The beautiful, proud eye, dark and lustrous, condescending to whatever it rested upon, was the more terrible. The lovely, languishing eye, the more repulsive, while the dim, sad eyes, less at variance with their settings, were sad exceedingly, and drew the heart in spite of the horror out of which they gazed. I rose and went among the apparitions, eager to understand something of their being and belongings. Were they souls, or were they and their rhythmic motions but phantasms of what had been? By look nor by gesture, not by slightest break in the measure, did they show themselves aware of me. I was not present to them. How much were they in relation to each other? Surely they saw their companions as I saw them. Or was each only dreaming itself and the rest? Did they know how they appeared to the others? A death with living eyes? Had they used their faces? Not for communication, not to utter thought and feeling, not to share existence with their neighbors, but to appear what they wished to appear and conceal what they were. And having made their faces masks, were they therefore deprived of those masks and condemned to go without faces until they repented? How long must they flaunt their facelessness in faceless eyes? I wondered. How long will the frightful punition endure? Have they at length begun to love and be wise? Have they yet yielded to the shame that has found them? I heard not a word, saw not a movement of one naked mouth. Were they because of lying bereft of speech? With their eyes they spoke as if longing to be understood. Was it truth or was it falsehood that spoke in their eyes? They seemed to know one another. Did they see one skull beautiful and another plain? Difference must be there, and they had had long study of skulls. My body was to theirs no obstacle. Was I a body, and were they but forms? Or was I but a form, and were they bodies? The moment one of the dancers came close against me, that moment he or she was on the other side of me, and I could tell, without seeing, which, whether man or woman, had passed through my house.
Mm. All right, Sherry. Let me pull the childlike question and say, what does that mean?
I don't know. I just find it interesting that he wants to talk about faces and fairy tales.
Mm-hmm.
This is the thing for me, you know, because and Jess and I were like I said, we talked at length about this a little bit today. Um, and he has a lot of questions in that excerpt out of Lilith, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
are do they see each other? Do they see each other the way I see them? Am I the body? Are they the forms? Are they are am I
Mm-hmm.
a form? Are they the like, how long will they the line in there? How long will they have to with their facelessness, endure their facelessness with faceless eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what does that I mean, okay, so what I'm thinking about when I read that the first time and and I think about this a lot is the idea of facing God as an orientation, right?
Mm-hmm.
You face and God calls us to face him, right? To turn and face, which
Mm-hmm.
is repentance, which is metanoia, which is an
Mm-hmm.
evolution of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But it has to happen. You need to face, like,
Yeah.
and you need a face. You need to face and you need a face.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
but
and like
I don't know how that,
even
go ahead.
I mean, it's interesting because a face is a. It's interesting that he says a fairy tale is like a face because a
Right.
face is like a is a guarantee of some sort of persona or personal identity, right? So we think of like the commandment in the Ten Commandments: "You shall have no other gods before me." The Hebrew word, I think, if I'm remembering, and maybe if Hezi or Yosef are listening in, they can correct me if I'm wrong.
Mhm.
Is that it's lepani, which is like pani is face. Uh, the panim is the face in the in the Hebrew the Hebrew word is yeah. So anyway, before is to the face, right? And in a sense, if you get the word picture of what to the to not have another image before God, is the reason why is that image is obstructing your view of the divine countenance,
Mhm,
right?
mhm, mhm.
And so like there's a that personal identity is conveyed when it's conveyed unobstructed, when there's nothing between us and the face
Right.
but the light that's shining upon us.
I think Jess also, I don't know what verse it was that he was reading out of, but it might have been out of Job, but there was the word translated into prayer was actually the Hebrew word for to face.
Mm-hmm.
Prayer, right? Was it like it was a prayer was an orientation towards God,
Mm-hmm.
facing,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and
But
so,
then,
but
but
to
wait,
broaden that out to but the fairy tale being a face,
mhm,
that's the
mhm.
question that I
I
wanted to
know. Yeah.
use that point to circle it back to is like,
Yeah.
do these tales become kind of like have a persona of their own? Like, is Lilith its own, in a sense,
Be
a kind of a person of its own
right.
being, its own world
Mhm,
that's
mhm.
enclosed within the story itself?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Like he also says in the other essay, he says he describes the face as that living eternally changeful symbol which God has hung in front of the unseen spirit,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's it's kind of a veil too.
Yeah.
And
But
in
it's
the
also a disclosure. It's a veil and a
and
disclosure.
disclosure. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, and the moon at the beginning of that quote from Lilith, the moon is the feminine, right? Which veils the forms, in the
Mm-hmm.
night, right? So things look differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're veiled and they're under the silvery light of the moon, you know.
Yeah.
And that's when he encounters these people, these faceless people, right?
Yeah.
So there's another faceless couple in the story
Yeah.
that are fighting with each other. Remember them?
Yes.
They're married couple.
Yep.
Yeah. And just because I have to do this, because I have to draw attention to George MacDonald, give him credit where credit is due. I think he actually coins the phrase "till they have faces" when he's talking about the couple. That they would be at odds with each other like that because they're fighting over luggage or something. I can't remember what it is. And and the character in the story says something about them going to be, they're going to be doing that until they have faces, right? And that's what Lewis Lewis calls his novel, till we have
Till we
faces.
have faces. Yeah. Which I think is maybe one of his best. It's a really good
I've
one.
heard, I haven't read it, so I
Yeah,
should
it's a
read it
challenge.
actually.
I
Yeah.
think he thought it. I think he thought a great deal of that one. I think he was very proud of it.
Hmm, hmm.
Um, well, we're coming up. Do you want to keep going? It looks like Luke may not be able to make it
Yeah.
in.
Well, I'm thinking for me, I'm going to have to go soon to make dinner. So, do we want to just wrap it up here for tonight?
I think we're at a good stopping point. I'm just trying to think if like I think we've kind of yeah, I think we're at a good stopping point because the next one is a pretty substantial paragraph and some big points that could use some
Yeah,
time unpacking.
that would be good and be fun to have others here too. I think Josh will be back next week, so that'll be good. And hopefully Luke and Jason can make it.
Yeah, it'd be wonderful.
Hmm. Okay, so I just wanted to say to anybody who watches this video, if anybody does, if you guys have any ideas about fairy tales and faces, please leave a comment
Yes.
because I'm just curious. He does say there is a great line here. Um, Many a man, however, who would not attempt to define a man. So it's only that kind of man. Okay. He makes
Mm-hmm.
that distinction. Any
Mm-hmm.
man who would not attempt to define a man, might venture to say something as to what a man ought to be. But even so much, I will not in this place venture with regard to the fairy tale. And then he goes on to say, for my long past work in that kind might but poorly instance or illustrate my now more matured judgment. So he's changed a little bit on
Yeah.
this, right? But I love the line, any man who would not attempt to define a man.
Hmm.
This is who I'm talking to,
Yeah.
right? So that's a very open-minded person, because a lot of times we want to define these things, right? We want to fine tune them. And he doesn't want to define the fairy tale either. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and like there's so much about a face that's indefinable. I mean, we know what a face is comprised of,
Well, we do have
two
that
eyes, a nose, a mouth, some
Mhm.
ears,
And we have
like,
that little cliche, you can't judge a book by its cover.
right. Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to diving in some more. And this is obviously like, imagination is near and dear. And so I
Yeah.
think we just need to keep
Yeah.
diving in and keep discussing. And for everyone who tuned in, and for those of you that were watching with us, and those of you that watch later, we really appreciate you taking
Yeah.
some time with us.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Jed, for doing this. I really appreciate it.
No
All
problem.
right. Good night, everybody. And see you next Friday.